We finally got around to reviewing the RX 590, the XFX Fatboy. It's got some thermal problems. We'll be talking about that later, but also not a whole lot of motive to review this quickly because it's a refresh. There's the RX 480, then the 580 came out, and it's a refresh of the 480. It's just pre-overclocked. The 590 came out, which is a pre-overclocked 580, which is a pre-overclocked 480. So it's not that inherently exciting. It's not new architecture. There's not a whole lot new going on, but it's still worth reviewing because even though it's a refresh, as we saw with the 580, it might have a pretty good place in the market. So the 580, despite being a refresh, a pre-overclocked one, did turn out to be a decent buy at its price point. And that's what we're gonna look at today with the RX 590, specifically the Fatboy model that we have here. And we'll talk thermals, power, and gaming performance. Before that, this video is brought to you by Corsair's Vengeance RGB memory. Corsair's Vengeance RGB RAM uses pre-screened ICs for better overclocking headroom and tighter timings. Corsair's RAM also has the benefit of wide-reaching motherboard support by landing on qualified vendor lists for motherboard makers, ensuring wide compatibility between boards. Learn more at the link in the description below. For the specs on this, if you want to know them, watch our RX 480 review from like 2 or 3 years ago, and then watch the 580 review. Those are the specs. It's a higher clock. So we've got that covered. Beyond that, pricing is probably the most relevant thing to know. So for perspective, the 1070 Ti costs about $360 to $450, depending on which model you're buying, when you buy it, where you buy it. The non-blower models, the ones that are actually worth buying, are closer to $430 to $450 US. So that's the 1070 Ti. The 590, the RX 590, costs about $260 for a model similar to this one. I think this is $270 right now. About the same thing though, $270, $260. So you're looking at $170 more for performance that, well, we'll talk about that later, but the 1070 Ti is a different class of performance. Not the best comparison then. A better comparison might be something like the 1060 or maybe the 1070. And because the RX 590 does fall between them in performance in a lot of instances, the pricing should also be between them. So 1060s these days, if you haven't looked, the 1060 6GB, the real, like the legitimate one, the original 1060 6GB, not to be confused with the other 5 that came out, that's about $210 in the US for one of those. And they go up to $240, $250. So not a ton of price movement, but a bit since it came out. And that puts it a little cheaper than this one, or you get the 1070 for something like 300 plus or minus 20 on average, 300, 320. So that's what you're looking at for the price stack up. So let's go through the game benchmarks. We'll talk about gaming, FPS, frame times, talking about thermals, power consumption, and a bit more for the XFX RX 590 Fatboy. Sniper Elite 4 gives us a look at a well-implemented DirectX 12 title with close to hardware programming, including asynchronous compute support. We'll start with our 4K results, as those are the more complete, and give us a good picture of scalability versus other hardware. Remember, the idea here is that we can see how the RX 590 compares relative to other devices, not necessarily to see absolute performance. We'll look at other results with lower resolutions for that angle. At 4K, using Sniper Elite as sort of a synthetic test for low-level APIs, we see the XFX RX 590 Fatboy runs at 43 FPS average when stock, or about 46 FPS average when overclocked. Lows for both results are good, with 1% at 41 FPS for the OC and 37 FPS for the stock result. This is indicative of fluid frame times, something we'll look at in our frame time plot next. And the frame rate isn't where we want it, but again, that's all relative to graphic settings. What's important here is that frame time consistency is there. Absolute numbers will rise with lower settings momentarily. As for the RX 580, the real one, the MSI RX 580 Gaming X, not the Dataland card, which is a 570, that AMD respun as a 580, we end up at 39 FPS for the 8GB Gaming X, which is the same as an overclocked RX 570, i.e. the Dataland RX 580. Overclocking the RX 580 to 1455 MHz gets it to 41 FPS average, roughly tied with the stock RX 590. That's because an RX 590 is an RX 580, but pre-overclocked, so this all makes sense. Comparatively, the GTX 1070 SC ends up at 48 FPS average, with the GTX 1060 6GB Gaming X at 37 FPS average. Just to be clear, that's the 1060 6GB, not to be confused with the 1063 GB with one fewer SM, nor the 1065 gigabyte, and most certainly not the 1066 gigabyte with 9 gigabits per second memory. And finally, and most definitely, absolutely, not the GTX 1060 GDDR5X 6 gigabyte card. Just the GTX 1060 6 gigabyte. NVIDIA has ensured that all future mentions of the GTX 1060 must be accompanied by this statement of clarification. The point is, the 1060 is beaten by the 590, which is functionally an overclocked 580, which was an overclocked RX 480. The 1060 with an overclock ends up at 40 FPS average, within striking range of the RX 590, but still outperformed by 7.8%. The GTX 1070 outperforms the stock RX 590 by about 12%, with a 1070 Ti at 57 FPS average, or leading by 32% when comparing only stock to stock. The frame time delta is about 17.67 milliseconds versus 23 milliseconds on the 590, so about 5.6 milliseconds difference. Frame times from the previous chart look like this. The GTX 1070 drew the most frames, of course, and also managed to keep consistently tight frame times with a frame-to-frame interval variance of plus or minus 1 millisecond. This is incredibly good performance and is commendable of the card. Remember, frame times are all about consistency of delivery. Being lower on the chart is better, but being consistent, frame to frame, is best. The 1070 is both, but it's also more expensive. Drawing the RX 580 line next, we see the frame time plot trends higher, closer to 25 to 30 milliseconds rather than 18 to 24 of the 1070. Frame-to-frame consistency is still good, with a frame-to-frame deviation of plus or minus 2 milliseconds on average. That is good performance and completely reasonable. The RX 590 Fatboy is next. Now, again, this is 4K resolution, so what we're looking at is the consistency of frame delivery, not the outright frame rate. The Fatboy plots with the line competitive to the GTX 1070 in frame time consistency. Its frame rate is lower and the count of frames rendered is reduced, as we saw in the previous chart, but its consistency is reliable. This is good because frame rate can be resolved by reducing graphics settings, but frame time consistency is difficult to fix. The 590 does this well, as do the other cards, and so finally we'll plot the GTX 1060 6GB for perspective. We see similarly commendable frame time consistency, but overall reduced frame rate. The higher placement on the y-axis means that the GTX 1060 runs slower in frame throughput than the other cards on the chart, despite competitive consistency of those fewer frames. The RX 590 ends up between the 1066 and the GTX 1070 cards in both frame rate and frame time performance. Enough 4K numbers. Let's look at a truncated chart with just 1080p. We haven't done as many lower-end devices on Sniper, so this chart is more limited in quantity of cards, but we'll make up for that in the next few games. These cards, of them, the RX 590 leads the GTX 1060 and somewhat meaningfully outperforms the RX 580. The RX 570 matches the RX 580 when overclocked, which is, as a reminder, what the Dataland RX 580 represents. So if you missed the previous content, the Dataland RX 580 is an RX 570. It's just AMD called it an RX 580 2048, made a new SKU out of the 570. That's what that card is. That's why there's scare quotes. So the scare quotes around the 580 are because it's a 570. The distribution doesn't have too much spread against these devices, but the 590 is in a better position than the other cards on the chart. As before, the 1070 would outperform the 590, but the 590 outperforms the 1060. For F1 2018, we look at the counterpart to Sniper Elite 4 by benchmarking with a prime example of a well-built DirectX 11 game. There are more API abstraction layers than with DirectX 12, but this particular game handles them well. At 4K, the RX 590 ends up at 38 FPS average stock, roughly tied with the overclocked variant's 40 FPS flat. The GTX 1070 ends up at 46 FPS average, and the RX 580 8GB Gaming X runs 35.7 FPS average when stock and 38 FPS average when overclocked. The overclocked result here puts it about on par with the RX 590 stock, although the overclocked 590 again pulls marginally ahead. 1440p is a more reasonable resolution for the 590, so we'll move to that chart now. 4K is not really the forte of the RX 590. At 1440p in F1 2018, the RX 590 8GB card ends up at 64 FPS average with 1% lows, averaging 47 FPS. Overclocking didn't do much for us, gaining an additional 3 FPS, and the GTX 1070 is the next card, somewhat distant, ranking at 78 FPS average and with lows similarly paced as the RX 590. The RX 590 outperforms the GTX 1060 6GB card when stock, running 57 FPS average, and overclocked, running 61 FPS average with a plus 100 core offset. For reference, the 1060 6GB card costs about $200 to $250, and depending on the model and the current sales. The RX 590 runs about $260 to $280 depending on model, and we'll talk value more later, but that gives you an idea of where they land. It's fully capable of 1440p though, and ranks between the 1070 and the 1060 6GB. At 1080p, the RX 590 ends up pushing 82 FPS average when stock or 85 FPS overclocked. Once again, overclocking is hardly useful for this GPU. The RX 590 performs about the same as the RX 580 Gaming X when it's overclocked to 1455 MHz, with both cards averaging 80 FPS. The 1060 overclocked is around the same performance, although gains against the baseline 1060 are noteworthy. The 1070 maintains a significant advantage of the 590 in these charts, plotting at 101 FPS average for the stock version. Far Cry 5 gives us a look at Ubisoft's Dunya engine, pulling a title with more geometric complexity and screen space reflections than some other testing we've gone through so far. For this one, the RX 590 Fatboy ends up at 30 FPS average, with an overclock pitifully pushing it to 31.5 FPS, so no real gain. The GTX 1070 runs at 36 FPS average, while the overclocked 580 Gaming X MSI card at 1455 MHz runs the same frame rate as the RX 590 since, it's an overclocked RX 580. None of these are particularly playable, so let's move on to 1440p. At 1440p, with the higher settings that we're using designated on the chart, things become reasonably playable. The RX 590 stock GPU operates an average frame rate of 55, which is ahead of an overclocked 1060 6GB card by about 3.9%. We're outside of standard deviation test to test, but not by much. The difference is imperceptible to the user. For a fairer comparison of stock to stock testing, the GTX 1060 6GB stock without an overclock ends up at 50 FPS average, still within reasonable range of the RX 590. The 590 doesn't hold as strong of an advantage here as it has in some other titles. The GTX 1070 SC's average frame rate of 67 FPS posts a lead of 21% over the 590 stock GPU, with the 580 roughly tied with the 1060. 1% and 0.1% lows are both well timed across all of these configurations. The most important thing to learn from our multi-resolution testing as we move into the 1080p chart is whether performance scales linearly across all resolutions. If it doesn't, that could be indicative of a pipeline limitation, ROPS, for example, or maybe video memory or texture map units. At 1080p in Far Cry 5, the RX 590 maintains similar spacing against the GTX 1060 and 1060 overclocked cards. It's tied with the overclocked 1060 and leading the stock by about 6.7%. Overclocking the RX 590 gets it to 80 FPS average, but there's just no more room left in this card to overclock any meaningful amount, at least not without mods. We see gains from overclocking of 2.4% over the stock RX 590, and finally the 1070 maintains a significant lead, posting a 96 FPS average over the 590's 78 FPS average. That's also accompanied by a price increase, of course, and we'll point out that Vega 56 does pretty well in this title also, posting a 104 FPS average with the Power Color stock model. The Vega 56 cards average about $450 to $470, so buyers of the 590 are likely not willing to stretch this high-end price. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is still relatively new and is meant to be one of the leading RTX titles, although our benchmarking is standardized without any RTX features. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is on a modified Crystal engine and uses DirectX 12 for its API. One note for this one, we had trouble getting the overclock to stabilize in this game for the 590, but eventually got it running at 1650 to 1660 MHz core rather than 1660 to 1670 in other titles. 4K isn't very friendly to this class of device when using the settings we were using, placing the RX 590 Fatboy at 28 FPS average with an overclock doing effectively nothing. The 1070 also struggles down at 30 FPS average with a 1070 Ti at 35 FPS, so let's move on right away. We can't learn much here. At 1440p, the RX 590 ends up at 50 FPS average with the overclock taking us only to 51.4 FPS. Not exciting, sadly, and about what we've been seeing thus far. The MSI RX 580 Gaming X at 1455 MHz hits 48 FPS average, positioning itself close enough to the 590 that the differences are imperceptible. The GTX 1070 holds a 55 FPS average, marking Shadow of the Tomb Raider as the title where the RX 590 strikes the closest to the GTX 1070, to the point that the value for this game best favors the 590. In terms of percentages, the 1070 holds just a lead of 8.5% over the 590, which holds a lead of roughly 11% over the stock 580 and the overclocked 1060 is around that range too. Running 1080p instead, the RX 590 ends up at 72 FPS average, which is completely playable while using high graphics settings. The overclock is, once again, pitiful, boosting us only 1.9%. That's disappointing, and there's really not much to be gained here because the card's already a pre-overclocked card. So, the RX 580 with an overclock is again close to the RX 590 stock GPU, not that exciting and predictable, but still an improvement of sorts. GTA 5 is last, using the Rage engine, which is redundant, by Rockstar Games. The benchmark is intensive on draw distance, particularly for geometric detail and shadow detail at long ranges. 4K is almost entirely unplayable with our very high and ultra mix of settings on our standardized test bench, and that's for the RX 590. The RX 590 is positioned with results of about 25 FPS average for the stock 590 Fatboy, or 23 FPS for the 580 Gaming X stock. Let's skip right over to 1440p. At 1440p, GTA positions the RX 590 Fatboy at 51 FPS average, tied exactly with the overclocked RX 580 Gaming X, and marginally ahead of the RX 580. Sort of boring, if we're being honest, but that's the nature of a refresh. If you already knew where the RX 580 landed when stock and overclocked, you could figure out where the RX 590 would be, and where it is. In this game, the GTX 1060 leads the performance over the RX 590 if GTA is the only thing you're playing, and if you can find a 1060 6GB for about $200 to $220, it'd be a better buy for this title. Branching out to other games would change that prioritization, and GTA is pretty old, so you also have to question how long you'd be playing only that game. These results are consistent with other sites and are a bit unique to GTA. 1080p for GTA gives us our last game test. The RX 590 and GTX 1060 maintain the same spacing as before, with the 1060 6GB card leading the 590 by large margins, marking 83 FPS average stock versus 76 FPS average stock. The 1070 pulls even further ahead, landing at 106 FPS average, and the overclocked MSI RX 580 is about the same as the 390X and the RX 590 when the 580 is overclocked. Power consumption is last. For this, we do total system power consumption logged over time, so this is not for the individual card, but for the entire test bench. All system components are heavily controlled, with voltages, even minor voltage rails, also heavily controlled to ensure data accuracy. The RX 590 stock GPU total system power consumption averages about 320 watts, with the MSI RX 580 Gaming X system averaging 20 to 30 watts lower on average, and that's without having the overclock applied, so that's stock. The GTX 1060 6GB total system power averages 240 watts when the 1060 is overclocked with a plus 100 MHz core offset, as shown in previous charts. The 590 is still a heavy drinker of power, as the previous RX 500 series cards have been. For thermals, we first tested the card with the stock VBIOS configuration, which is with the switch set toward the PCIe connectors. XFX says this is the faster fan speed VBIOS, or the more aggressive VBIOS, but that was clearly inaccurate. The GPU core hits about 79 to 80 degrees Celsius at steady state, which is the temperature target for this VBIOS. This is the stock setting. Under these settings, the VRAM module we measured climbs to a high 91.8 degrees Celsius. This is nearing the specification limit of GDDR5, and once accounting for measurement error and the fact that we're looking at T-case, not T-junction, might even be hitting the spec limit. It's close enough to be disquieting. The MOSFET we measured is at 85 degrees. This is hot and uncompetitive, but is technically well within the operating temperature specs for MOSFETs. Most FETs can take 125 to 150 degrees Celsius, so we're not in any danger here. It's just not competitive with other coolers and is indicative of inefficient design and use of an otherwise large cooler. It's not efficient for how big it is. Fan speed for this VBIOS hits around 1500 RPM to maintain 80 degrees on the GPU, but the trouble is that the neighboring components run hot. With the left VBIOS switch engaged instead, not the stock position, the GPU core runs 69 to 70 degrees Celsius with the VRAM now at 81 degrees, definitely more acceptable, and the MOSFET at 74 degrees. Considering fan speed is now 2000 RPM, up from 1490 to 1500, this remains uncompetitive with others on the market, but is more acceptable than the stock measurements. You'll want to switch into this mode for normal use, especially if in a hotter case and one that might push ambient temperatures higher than the 22 plus or minus 1 degrees that we test in. And just as a reminder, we pointed all of this out when we did the teardown of the RX 590. It was a while ago, but we'll cut to some footage of it just as a reminder. Instead of using a copper cold plate contacting everything, or even an aluminum one, they're using a steel cold plate contacting the VRAM, and that's connected via screws, then connected to the rest of the cooler. So it would have made more sense to do some kind of direct contact, even with just pads or paste or something between the VRAM and the heat pipes or whatever's there. Ideally, you go with a larger single plate that covers the GPU and the VRAM, or one that maybe has a step down for the GPU for clearance purposes. But with a design that was chosen where it's multiple connecting interfaces, you lose efficiency every time you transfer heat through a new interface, and there are a lot of them here for this card. So it is inefficient, and it runs hot for the VRAM as a result. This is something that we warned about when we tore the card apart, but now it's more evident that it is a problem. Conclusively then, the RX 590 is boring. Doesn't mean it's bad, it doesn't mean it doesn't have a place in the market, but it is genuinely a boring product to work on or review. Now, that's okay, because in terms of price to performance, it does fine. It's the same as it's almost literally the same as buying an RX 580 and then overclocking it. So obviously there's no reason to upgrade if you have a 480 or 580 to this. If you don't have one of those, you could buy the RX 590 if it's at $260, $270, 8GB model, and performance is pretty good actually. It's really not bad. Frame times were consistent overall. There were no major problems with frame times. We did not have major problems with drivers. A lot of those seem to have been fixed lately with AMD's efforts there. Overclocking, extremely uninteresting. We'd recommend instead something like Vega 56. Significantly more expensive to go that route, but if you want something for overclocking for fun, like that's why you're buying it, not just for gaming, then don't bother. Don't buy this for that. Vega 56 is good for that route if you prefer to go that route and stay AMD. And honestly, 56 is a bit more fun to work with for overclocking than NVIDIA anyway. You have more freedom with it. But as a card, out of the box, it's fine. It's not exciting. It is a fair replacement for the 1060 if you're looking at 1060s as one of your options right now, and you can't find them maybe in your region for the prices we have here, like $210. Then this is superior at the same price for sure. It's in some games superior at higher prices because it's never really more than $40, $50 more. And depending on the game workload you're looking at, the 590 does better enough that it's worth buying. There are instances where that's not true. GTA 5, and this is consistent in other tests we've looked at, GTA 5 specifically does favor the 1060 over even the 590. So if that's the only game you're playing, then don't bother. But otherwise, if you're playing more things, it seems fine. 1070, you get, I don't know, anywhere from 7 to 12% more performance on average. There are a couple games where that's way less. Just depends on the title, but 7 to 12% more performance. Looking at like $40 more for the low-end 1070s, 50, 60 for the mid-range ones. So pricing is just, it's really granular right now. NVIDIA has 18 billion SKUs of Pascal cards, and AMD is intending to compete with just as many of Polaris cards. So you end up with a product stack where telling you which one to buy is very much going game by game, card by card, and saying, get this one for this game, get this one for that game. And so all I can say is look at the charts. And I can tell you that this specific model, probably not one we'd recommend necessarily. The thermal performance is a joke. A lot of the, I mean, in one of those tests, thermals were hitting like 90 degrees Celsius on some of the power components, which is technically within spec. But if you're going to make a card this literally named the Fatboy and being bigger than 2 slots, make it cool. So we don't recommend this specific model. The 590 as a product itself seems fair. It's fine, but get a different one. This one is just, the cooling is just, no. So that's it for this one. Subscribe for more. As always, you can go to store.nexus.net to help us out directly. Hopefully we'll have some more exciting GPUs coming from AMD at some point in the future, and as soon as we do, we'll review those as well and let you know how they do. I'll see you all next time.